The zip ties cut into her wrists as the trunk lid slammed shut, plunging Chief Petty Officer Maya Blackwater into complete darkness. 3 armed men had just made the biggest mistake of their criminal careers. They'd kidnapped a Navy SEAL and locked her in what they thought was an inescapable metal coffin. In exactly 47 minutes, those same men would be zip-tied on the warehouse floor, unconscious and bleeding, while local law enforcement tried to piece together how a 5'4" woman had turned their foolproof kidnapping operation into their worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maya pressed her back against the spare tire, feeling the familiar burn of adrenaline coursing through her veins as the stolen Suburban lurched forward into the Nevada desert night. Her captors had no idea they'd just triggered a predator's hunting instincts in someone trained to escape from far worse situations than the trunk of a modified Chevy. The irony wasn't lost on her. These criminals thought they'd trapped their prey, but they'd actually locked themselves in a cage with something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. Hey folks, whether you're watching from military installations or your living rooms, make sure to hit subscribe, because these stories of our nation's most elite warriors need to be heard. This is the incredible true account of how 3 seasoned criminals learned the hard way that Navy SEALs are trained to turn any environment into their tactical advantage, even when that environment is the cramped confines of a vehicle trunk. Speeding through the middle of nowhere, the abduction had started at 2,147 hours outside Rossetti's Italian Bistro in downtown Las Vegas, where Maya had been celebrating her younger sister's engagement with family. She'd chosen a table with clear sightlines to all entrances, her back to the wall. Old habits from 8 years in naval special warfare never died, even during civilian celebrations. The 3 men who'd been watching her for the past 40 minutes thought they were dealing with just another pretty brunette in designer jeans and heels, someone who'd make perfect leverage in their high-stakes extortion scheme. What they didn't know was that Maya Blackwater had spent the last decade becoming one of the most lethal operators in SEAL Team 7, with deployment rotations through Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia that had earned her 2 Bronze Stars and a reputation among her teammates as someone who could extract herself from situations that would break most warriors. They couldn't have known that beneath her elegant dinner attire, her muscle memory was already cataloging escape routes, potential weapons, and the tactical disadvantages of each attacker. The largest of the 3, a heavily tattooed man later identified as Vincent "Tank" Morrison, had approached her table with a story about a car accident involving her rental vehicle. Professional, apologetic, concerned. Exactly the kind of social engineering that worked on 99% of targets. But Maya had noticed the nervous fidgeting of his supposed partner across the restaurant, the way the 3rd man kept checking his watch by the entrance, and most tellingly, how Tank's eyes never quite met hers when he spoke. She'd excused herself to check on the supposed accident, following Tank toward the exit while her trained senses screamed warnings about the setup developing around her. In the parking lot, she'd counted 3 possible escape vectors before Tank's partners emerged from behind parked cars, one producing a taser, the other brandishing chrome-plated .45. The electric shock that dropped her to the asphalt lasted exactly long enough for them to flex cuff her hands behind her back and drag her toward their waiting vehicle. "Rich, Daddy's gonna pay real nice for his little princess," Tank had muttered as they forced her into the trunk, clearly believing he'd captured some wealthy socialite whose family would wire millions for her safe return. The assumption was understandable. Maya's off-duty appearance, combined with her presence at an upscale restaurant, painted a picture of privilege and vulnerability that these career criminals found irresistible. They'd even disabled the trunk's emergency release, cut the tail light wires from inside, and welded shut the fold-down rear seat access, modifications that would have trapped any ordinary victim in a nightmare scenario with no possibility of escape or rescue. Tank had boasted about these preparations while securing her restraints, explaining how their mobile prison had successfully held 12 previous victims without a single escape attempt. But ordinary victims didn't possess Maya's specialized training from the Navy's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape program, where she'd learned to view confinement not as helplessness, but as tactical preparation time. They didn't carry the psychological conditioning of someone who'd been captured twice during overseas operations and had turned both situations into mission successes through patience, planning, and precise application of violence when the moment presented itself. As the Suburban continued its journey toward what Tank had called their desert facility, Maya was already working through her escape sequence, feeling along the trunk's interior for structural weaknesses while testing the flexibility of her restraints. Her captors had made their first mistake by underestimating their target. Their second mistake was believing that steel and distance would keep them safe from the consequences of that underestimation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the darkness of that trunk, Maya smiled grimly as she began the methodical process of transforming their perfect crime into their perfect downfall. They wanted to find out what happened when you trapped a Navy SEAL. They were about to receive a very expensive education in why naval special warfare operators are taught that there's no such thing as an inescapable situation, only insufficient motivation to escape. Chief Petty Officer Maya Blackwater had earned her SEAL trident through a combination of genetics, obsession, and the kind of focused rage that transforms impossible odds into tactical advantages. At 29 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 in boots, with the deceptive build of a distance runner hiding explosive power, developed through 8 years of naval special warfare operations. Her personnel file listed her as one of only 7 women to successfully complete the SEAL pipeline. But what it didn't capture was the predatory stillness that her teammates recognized when situations turned lethal. The trunk's darkness didn't faze her. During Hell Week at Basic Underwater Demolition Training Coronado, she'd spent 14 hours buried in sand with only a breathing tube, learning that darkness was just another environmental factor to overcome rather than fear. Her instructors had called it comfort with the uncomfortable, the ability to find operational clarity in situations designed to break lesser minds. Now feeling the Suburban suspension compress over rough terrain, Maya was already shifting into the mental state her Team's 7 brothers knew as Blackwater mode. Born and raised in the mountain town of Cedar Ridge, Montana, Maya had grown up understanding that survival wasn't a skill you learned in classrooms. It was something you earned through experience with consequences. Her childhood had been spent tracking elk through blizzards with her father, learning to read terrain and weather patterns that could kill the unprepared. By age 12, she could field dress a deer, start a fire in sub-zero temperatures with wet matches, and navigate 20 miles of wilderness using only stars and topographic memory. What made Maya different from other SEAL candidates wasn't just her technical proficiency or physical conditioning. It was her relationship with violence. Where others saw brutality, she saw problem-solving. Where others experienced fear, she felt the familiar calm that preceded precise action. Her psychological evaluations consistently noted her ability to compartmentalize emotional responses during high-stress situations, transforming anger and fear into tactical fuel rather than allowing them to cloud judgment. The flex cuffs around her wrists were standard law enforcement restraints, rated for 350 pounds of tensile strength. Maya had escaped from similar restraints during SEAR training by dislocating her own thumb, a technique that required accepting pain as a temporary inconvenience rather than an obstacle. But tonight, she had better options. The criminals had positioned her hands behind her back in the classic arrest position. But they'd failed to account for the hypermobility she'd developed through years of yoga and contortion training, designed to help operators escape from confined spaces. Her teammates at SEAL Team 7 knew her by the call sign Ghost, earned during a hostage rescue operation in Syria, where she'd infiltrated a fortified compound through a drainage pipe barely 18 inches in diameter, neutralized 4 guards silently, and extracted 3 American contractors before enemy forces realized their perimeter had been compromised. The mission brief had listed the drainage infiltration as impossible for personnel over 140 pounds, but Maya had proven that impossible was just another word for requiring creative problem-solving. Maya's specialty within her platoon was close-quarters battle and urban warfare, but her real gift was psychological operations. She understood that the most effective weapon in any confrontation wasn't superior firepower, it was the enemy's assumptions about their own advantages. Let opponents believe they held tactical superiority, then systematically dismantle those assumptions until their confidence transformed into panic. It was a lesson she'd learned not from military manuals, but from years of being underestimated because of her size and gender. The kidnappers had grabbed her purse and searched it hastily, finding nothing more threatening than credit cards, makeup, and breath mints. They'd missed the custom-fitted titanium ring on her middle finger, designed to look like simple jewelry, but featuring edges sharp enough to cut through plastic restraints when applied with sufficient pressure and technique. They'd also failed to check her seemingly innocent ankle bracelet, which contained 30 feet of aircraft-grade steel, cable disguised as decorative chain links. As the vehicle continued its journey through what she estimated was now desert terrain. Based on the sound patterns reaching her through the trunk floor, Maya methodically cataloged her resources. Physical capabilities, uncompromised despite the taser shock, with full range of motion once restraints were removed. Environmental factors, enclosed space approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, spare tire providing leverage points, tool compartments accessible if she could reach them. Enemy intelligence, 3 subjects, armed but overconfident, believing they controlled the situation. Most importantly, they'd made the fundamental error that ended most criminal careers. They'd confused tactical advantage with strategic superiority. Locking her in this trunk gave them temporary control over her location, but it also meant they'd voluntarily entered a confined space with someone trained to turn confinement into preparation time. Maya had spent months learning to operate effectively in spaces much smaller than this trunk, often while under hostile fire and with limited oxygen. Her pulse remained steady at 68 beats per minute as she began working her way out of the restraints, using controlled breathing techniques to manage the pain of joint manipulation. Tank and his partners thought they'd captured a victim. What they'd actually done was give a Navy SEAL 47 minutes of uninterrupted time to plan their tactical destruction. In excruciating detail, the education they were about to receive would be brief, painful, and permanent. Maya's captors had no idea they'd just kidnapped someone who'd been winning underground fighting competitions since she was 16, or that her unassuming appearance concealed skills developed in places most people couldn't imagine existed. While Tank and his crew congratulated themselves on their smooth abduction, they remained blissfully unaware that their helpless victim possessed capabilities that would have impressed her own SEAL instructors. The foundation of Maya's hidden arsenal had been built in the most unlikely of places, her grandmother's basement in Cedar Ridge, where Eleanor Nana Blackwater had operated an unofficial but legendary training facility for what she diplomatically called women's self-defense. What the local community didn't know was that Nana had spent 12 years as a CIA operative specializing in escape and evasion techniques before retiring to Montana in 1987. Her basement wasn't just a gym, it was a laboratory for developing skills that could save lives in the worst possible circumstances. Every summer from age 14 to 18, Maya had descended those basement stairs at dawn, where Nana would put her through training regimens that made military boot camps look like gentle calisthenics. Pretty girls become targets, Maya, her grandmother would say while demonstrating how to dislocate an attacker's shoulder, using nothing but thumb pressure and leverage. Smart girls become survivors. Trained girls become predators. The basement had been configured to simulate every confined space scenario Nana could imagine: car trunks, shipping containers, crawl spaces, storm drains, even coffins. Maya had spent hundreds of hours learning to escape from restraints while blindfolded, upside down, or underwater. She'd practiced lock-picking until she could open handcuffs with a bobby pin in under 30 seconds, even with her hands bound behind her back and her fingers numb from cold. Nana's most valuable lessons weren't about physical techniques. They were about psychological warfare. Men like Tank rely on intimidation because it works on most people. Her grandmother had explained while teaching Maya to read facial expressions and voice patterns that revealed an opponent's true confidence level. But intimidation only works if you accept their version of reality. The moment you stop believing in their power, they become just another problem to solve. Maya's unofficial education had extended beyond her grandmother's basement into the underground fighting circuits that operated in the shadows of Montana's mining towns. Using fake identification that listed her age as 21, she'd started competing in no-holds-barred tournaments where the only rules were no weapons and no permanent damage. The fights took place in abandoned warehouses, ranch barns, and sometimes just clearings in the woods where miners, ranch hands, and drifters would bet serious money on outcomes determined by pain tolerance and tactical creativity. Her fighting style had evolved through necessity rather than formal training. At 5 feet 4 inches and 135 pounds, she couldn't rely on power or intimidation like her larger opponents. Instead, she developed what other fighters called ghost techniques, methods that used an opponent's strength and aggression against them while targeting vulnerabilities they didn't know they possessed. Pressure points that could cause temporary paralysis, joint manipulations that created systemic muscle failure, and psychological tactics that turned confident aggressors into panicked victims. The underground circuit had taught Maya something no military training could provide: how to fight dirty and win against opponents who outweighed her by 50 to 100 pounds. She'd learned to use fingernails as weapons, to target soft tissue areas that protective gear couldn't cover, and to create psychological pressure through techniques that looked almost supernatural to untrained observers. By age 18, she'd earned a reputation as someone who could end fights before her opponents realized they'd started. Her most devastating technique had been developed during a particularly brutal match against a 240-pound ex-convict known as Crusher Jenkins, who'd boasted that he'd never been submitted by anyone under 200 pounds. Maya had used what she called cascade pressure, applying multiple simultaneous pressure points that created a neurological overload, causing temporary paralysis that allowed her to apply a submission hold with minimal physical force. Jenkins had tapped out in confusion, unable to explain to his friends how he'd been dominated by someone half his size. The money she'd earned from fighting had paid for specialized training that complemented her grandmother's teachings. Summers, working at a prestigious escape room facility in Seattle, had taught her advanced lock manipulation and mechanical engineering principles. A winter spent with survival experts in Alaska had refined her ability to remain calm and tactical under extreme physical stress. Most importantly, 6 months training with former special operations personnel at a private facility in Colorado had introduced her to techniques that even experienced military operators rarely encountered. Maya's hidden capabilities extended into areas that would have surprised even her SEAL teammates. She'd spent 2 years learning from a former Soviet Spetsnaz operator who specialized in what he called urban camouflage, the ability to become effectively invisible in populated areas through body language, movement patterns, and psychological manipulation. She could alter her apparent height, weight, and even ethnic appearance through techniques that relied on observer psychology rather than physical disguise. Her electronics training had come from an unlikely source, a convicted hacker named Marcus Chun, who'd traded computer skills for fighting lessons during her underground circuit days. Marcus had taught her to hotwire vehicles, disable security systems, and most relevantly for her current situation, override the electronic components that controlled modern automotive systems. What Tank's crew didn't know was that they're escape-proof. Trunk modifications could be defeated by someone who understood the relationship between electrical systems and mechanical components. The psychological conditioning that allowed Maya to remain calm in extreme situations had been forged through experiences that went far beyond military training. She'd survived a mine collapse during a summer job, spending 18 hours trapped in a space barely larger than a coffin while rescue crews worked overhead. She'd been caught in an avalanche during a winter survival course, buried under 8 feet of snow with only a small air pocket, using meditation techniques to slow her metabolism until searchers could locate her. As the Suburban hit another pothole, jarring her against the trunk's interior, Maya felt the familiar sensation of her training taking control. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled, while her mind systematically processed the tactical situation with the cold efficiency that had made her legendary among her peers. Tank and his partners thought they'd captured a victim, but they'd actually given a predator exactly what she needed: time, motivation, and the element of surprise. The roots of Maya's unbreakable spirit traced back to the windswept mountains of Cedar Ridge, Montana, where her father, Marcus Storm Blackwater, had built a legacy that shaped everything she would become. Storm wasn't just another ex-military father trying to live vicariously through his children. He was a former Delta Force operator whose 23-year career had taken him through conflicts most people never knew existed, and whose approach to parenting involved preparing his daughter for a world that wouldn't hesitate to test her limits. Storm had named his daughter Maya after the ancient concept of illusion and perception, believing that understanding the difference between appearance and reality would be her greatest survival tool. The world will try to tell you who you are based on what they see, he'd explained during their first wilderness training session when she was only 7 years old. Your job is to control what they see while becoming something they can't imagine. Their family ranch sat on 4,000 acres of some of Montana's most unforgiving terrain, where winter temperatures regularly dropped to 30 below zero and summer storms could trap travelers for days in flash flood conditions. Storm had deliberately chosen this location, not for its beauty or convenience, but because it provided the perfect training environment for developing the kind of mental and physical resilience that couldn't be taught in classrooms or gymnasiums. Maya's childhood had been structured around what Storm called graduated exposure systematically, introducing her to increasingly challenging situations that built confidence through competence rather than empty encouragement. At age 8, she was tracking wounded deer through dense forest, learning to read blood trails and behavioral patterns that revealed an animal's condition and likely direction. By 10, she was spending entire weekends alone in the wilderness with nothing but basic survival gear, developing the self-reliance that would later serve her through the most brutal aspects of SEAL training. The lessons went far beyond outdoor skills. Storm had recognized early that his daughter possessed an unusual combination of analytical intelligence and physical coordination, traits that he systematically developed through training regimens adapted from his Delta Force experience. Their morning runs weren't just cardiovascular exercise. They were navigation challenges where Maya had to reach specific waypoints, using only compass bearings and terrain features, often while carrying weighted packs that tested her endurance and determination. Storm's approach to physical Conditioning focused on functional strength rather than impressive numbers. Maya learned to climb vertical rock faces using techniques that emphasize technique and mental control over brute force. She mastered swimming in water so cold that hypothermia became a constant threat, developing the ability to function effectively even when her body was screaming for relief. Most importantly, she learned to compartmentalize physical discomfort, treating pain as information rather than instruction. The psychological foundation Storm provided proved even more valuable than the physical training. He'd survived situations during his military career that had broken other operators, and he understood that true resilience came from accepting reality rather than avoiding it. Fear is just your brain trying to keep you alive, he'd explained during their discussions about risk management and decision-making. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's making good decisions despite being afraid. Maya's mother, Dr. Sarah Blackwater, contributed her own unique perspective to their daughter's development. As a trauma surgeon who'd spent 15 years in emergency medicine, Sarah understood stress physiology from a medical perspective that complemented Storm's tactical knowledge. She taught Maya to recognize and manage her body's responses to extreme situations, using breathing techniques and mental exercises that could maintain cognitive function even during life-threatening scenarios. The combination of Storm's military expertise and Sarah's medical knowledge created a training environment that prepared Maya for challenges neither parent could have anticipated. They taught her to view her body as a sophisticated machine that could be optimized through proper training and maintenance, rather than a source of limitation or weakness. By age 15, Maya's resting heart rate was 42 beats per minute. Her body fat percentage was 12%, and she could function effectively after 48 hours without sleep. Storm's military connections provided access to training opportunities that civilian children never encountered. Summer camps with other special operations families exposed Maya to international perspectives on tactics and survival, where she learned from British SAS veterans, Israeli commandos, and former Soviet Special Forces operators who'd settled in remote areas of the American West. These informal gatherings functioned as advanced universities for developing skills that conventional education couldn't provide. Psychological conditioning proved as important as the physical training. Storm had experienced capture and interrogation during classified operations, and he understood that mental preparation was often the difference between survival and psychological destruction. He taught Maya meditation techniques borrowed from various spiritual traditions, not for religious purposes, but because they provided tools for maintaining emotional control during extreme stress. Maya's teenage years had been spent mastering skills that most adults never attempted. She learned to fly small aircraft through mountain passes where navigation errors meant death, developing the kind of three-dimensional spatial reasoning that would later help her excel at tactical planning. Winter expeditions in conditions that forced mountain rescue services to suspend operations taught her to function when survival depended entirely on personal competence and equipment. Reliability. Storm's influence extended beyond practical skills into philosophical frameworks that shaped Maya's approach to challenges. He'd taught her to view obstacles as opportunities for demonstrating capability rather than sources of frustration or defeat. Easy doesn't make you stronger became a family motto that guided decisions about education, recreation, and personal development. When other parents were protecting their children from difficulty, Storm was systematically exposing Maya to controlled challenges that built unshakable confidence. The ranch itself became Maya's first classroom in tactical thinking. Storm had designed their daily routines around principles of operational security, situational awareness, and contingency planning that reflected his military background. Maya learned to notice details that others missed, to identify potential threats before they materialized, and to maintain multiple escape routes from any environment she entered. By the time Maya left for Navy boot camp at age 18, she possessed capabilities that impressed even experienced military instructors. But more importantly, she carried with her the psychological foundation that Storm and Sarah had spent years building, an unshakable belief that any situation could be survived through proper preparation, tactical thinking, and refusing to accept defeat as an option. As the Suburban continued its journey through the Nevada desert, that foundation proved its worth. Maya wasn't just a kidnapping victim hoping for rescue. She was Storm Blackwater's daughter, trained since childhood to turn impossible situations into tactical victories. Most influential figure in Maya's tactical education hadn't been a military instructor or survival expert. It had been her maternal grandfather, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, a former Soviet Spetsnaz operative who defected to the United States in 1979 and spent the remainder of his life perfecting unconventional warfare techniques in the isolation of rural Montana. Volf had arrived in Cedar Ridge when Maya was 12, carrying secrets that the CIA had paid millions to acquire and a training philosophy that would transform her understanding of what human beings could accomplish under impossible circumstances. Volf's background read like something from a spy novel, though Maya wouldn't learn the full details until years later. Born in Stalingrad during the siege, raised in Soviet military academies, he'd spent 15 years conducting operations so classified that even their existence remained officially denied. His specialty had been deep penetration missions behind enemy lines, often lasting months in hostile territory where capture meant torture and execution. What made Volf legendary among intelligence professionals wasn't his individual missions, but his development of escape and evasion techniques that revolutionized how special operations personnel approached captivity and constraint. The old man had settled in a cabin on the remote edge of the Blackwater ranch, ostensibly to live quietly in retirement. In reality, he'd come to Montana because Storm Blackwater had been one of the American operatives who'd facilitated his defection, and Volf had promised to share his knowledge with Storm's family as repayment for the risks taken on his behalf. Maya became the primary beneficiary of that promise, though she initially saw Volf as simply another eccentric relative with interesting stories and unusual hobbies. Volf's training methods reflected decades of experience with situations where conventional escape techniques failed. Unlike American military training, which focused on overpowering captors or exploiting obvious weaknesses, Volf taught what he called invisible resistance, methods that allowed captives to maintain agency while appearing completely helpless. His philosophy centered on the idea that the most effective escape began long before the captor realized an escape was being attempted. The cabin where Volf conducted Maya's education had been modified to serve as a comprehensive training facility disguised as a simple mountain retreat. The basement contained restraint systems designed to simulate every method of captivity Volf had encountered or could imagine: handcuffs, zip ties, rope bindings, chains, even exotic restraints used by intelligence agencies for psychological intimidation. Maya spent countless hours learning to escape from each system using techniques that required no tools except knowledge of human anatomy and materials science. Volf's approach to teaching escape techniques was methodical and scientific. He'd begin each lesson by explaining the engineering principles behind different restraint systems, helping Maya understand why certain materials failed under specific conditions. Zip ties, for example, were designed to resist pulling force, but were vulnerable to precise rotational pressure apply at their weakest structural point. Metal handcuffs could be defeated through controlled joint dislocation if the operator understood the relationship between bone structure and locking mechanisms. Wolf's most valuable lessons concerned psychological manipulation during captivity. He'd observed that most captors derived confidence from their victims' apparent helplessness, becoming careless when they believed their control was absolute. Maya learned to project defeated submission while systematically gathering intelligence about her captors' habits, weaknesses, and security procedures. The key was patience, allowing captors to become comfortable with routines that could later be exploited. Wolf had survived 3 separate capture incidents during his operational career, each lasting weeks or months under conditions designed to break his will. His survival had depended on techniques that went beyond physical escape methods into pure psychological endurance. He taught Maya meditation exercises borrowed from Tibetan monks, breathing techniques that could slow her heart rate to near-death levels, and mental compartmentalization methods that allowed conscious thought to continue even during extreme physical trauma. The old soldier's training included scenarios that American military programs would have considered too dangerous for training purposes. Maya learned to maintain consciousness while being choked unconscious, using controlled breathing to extend her survival time during suffocation attempts. She practiced escaping from restraints while underwater, developing the ability to hold her breath for over 4 minutes while performing complex motor tasks. Most disturbingly, she learned to dislocate her own joints systematically, treating the resulting pain as a temporary inconvenience rather than a barrier to continued action. Wolf's philosophical approach to captivity transformed Maya's understanding of powerlessness itself. Captors believe they control you because they control your movement, he'd explain while demonstrating advanced rope escape techniques. But they only control your body, your mind, your planning, your preparation for the moment when their control fails. These things remain yours unless you surrender them voluntarily. The weapons training Wolf provided went far beyond conventional firearms instruction. Maya learned to create lethal implements from everyday objects, how a plastic pen could become a stabbing weapon, how shoelaces could serve as garrotes, how broken glass could be shaped into cutting tools using only pressure and patience. More importantly, she learned to recognize the tactical potential in any environment, viewing even the most restricted spaces as potential armories for those who understood improvisation. Wolf's influence extended into areas that would prove crucial during Maya's current predicament. He'd taught her to read the emotional states of captors through vocal patterns and behavior changes, knowledge that could predict when guards would become careless or when violence was imminent. Understanding the psychology of criminal confidence allowed her to manipulate her captors' perceptions, appearing more helpless than she actually was while gathering information that would facilitate her eventual escape. The training had included extensive work with confined spaces, since Wolf understood that many captivity scenarios involved restricting movement to break prisoners psychologically. Maya had spent hours in spaces smaller than the Suburban's trunk, learning to remain calm and tactical even when claustrophobia triggered panic responses in most people. Wolf had taught her to view confinement as preparation time rather than helplessness, using restricted movement as an opportunity to plan rather than despair. Perhaps most importantly, Wolf had instilled in Maya an understanding that true escape rarely involved a single dramatic moment. Instead, successful escapes were usually the culmination of dozens of small preparations and observations, building toward a moment when multiple factors aligned to create opportunity. Patience wasn't just a virtue during captivity. It was a tactical requirement that separated successful escapes from desperate failures. As Maya continued working on her restraints in the darkness of the trunk, Wolf's voice seemed to whisper guidance from memory. They think they have trapped you, little Wolf. Show them what happens when they cage a predator instead of prey. Maya's path to naval special warfare had begun with a lie she'd told to a Navy recruiter in Billings, Montana, on her 18th birthday. When Petty Officer Second Class Rodriguez asked why she wanted to join the Navy, Maya had given the expected answer about serving her country and seeking adventure. The truth was far more complex. She'd spent 4 years watching her father struggle with demons that civilian life couldn't address. And she'd recognized in herself the same restlessness that came from being trained for challenges that ordinary existence couldn't provide. Decision to pursue SEAL training had crystallized during her first week at Navy Boot Camp in Great Lakes, Illinois, where she'd quickly realized that standard military training felt like remedial education after Storm and Wolf's preparation. While other recruits struggled with basic physical conditioning and stress management, Maya found herself helping drill instructors identify candidates who were likely to fail psychological screening. Her combination of physical capability and analytical observation skills caught the attention of Chief Petty Officer Williams, a former SEAL who'd been assigned to identify potential special operations candidates. Williams had initially dismissed Maya's interest in SEAL training as unrealistic ambition, pointing out that no woman had ever completed the pipeline, and that the physical requirements alone eliminated most male candidates. But during a training exercise that required recruits to escape from a simulated prisoner of war scenario, Maya had demonstrated capabilities that made Williams reconsider his assumptions. While other recruits focused on overpowering their mock captors through brute force, Maya had systematically exploited weaknesses in the exercise design, escaping from restraints that were supposed to be impossible to defeat and completing the scenario faster than any recruit in the exercises. History, the conversation that changed Maya's trajectory, had taken place in Williams' office after the POW exercise, where the chief had asked pointed questions about her background and training. Maya had been selective with her answers, mentioning her wilderness experience and physical conditioning, while avoiding details about Wolf's specialized instruction or her underground fighting career. Williams had recognized that she was withholding information, but he'd also observed that her capabilities suggested training sources beyond what most civilians accessed. Maya's path through Navy medical training had been strategically chosen to build credentials that would support her SEAL aspirations. As a hospital corpsman, she'd learned advanced trauma medicine and emergency procedures that complemented her existing survival skills, while providing valuable experience with stress management in life-threatening situations. Her assignment to Marine infantry units during deployment rotations had been specifically requested, giving her combat exposure that would later prove essential during SEAL selection. Her first deployment to Afghanistan with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, had introduced Maya to combat realities that no training could fully simulate. Operating from Forward Operating Base Chapman in Coast Province, she'd served as the primary medic for a rifle company conducting daily patrols in territory where Taliban forces maintained significant influence. The deployment had lasted 13 months, during which Maya had treated over 40 combat casualties while participating in more than 200 patrol operations. Defining moment of her Afghan deployment had occurred during a complex ambush near the village of Zormat, where her patrol had been pinned down by coordinated machine gun and mortar fire for over 6 hours. When the patrol's radio operator had been critically wounded by shrapnel, Maya had crawled 200 meters through active fire to reach him, performing emergency surgery under combat conditions that would have challenged experienced trauma surgeons. Her actions during the engagement had earned her a Navy Commendation Medal with Combat 5. But more importantly, they'd proven her ability to function effectively under the kind of extreme stress that eliminated many special operations candidates. Maya's second deployment had taken her to Syria as part of a joint task force, supporting Kurdish forces against ISIS positions, operating from a classified location near the Turkish border. She'd served as both medic and intelligence analyst, using her language skills and cultural knowledge to gather information from refugee populations while providing medical support for special operations teams. conducting direct action missions against high-value targets. The Syrian deployment had exposed Maya to a level of operational sophistication that prepared her for the complexity of SEAL missions. She'd participated in planning sessions for raids that required precise coordination between air assets, ground forces, and intelligence platforms, learning to think tactically about missions that involved multiple moving parts and minimal margin for error. Her medical skills had proven invaluable during operations where wounded personnel needed immediate treatment under fire, often in locations where standard evacuation procedures were impossible. Between deployments, Maya had used her leave time to pursue additional training that would strengthen her SEAL application. A mountain warfare course in Colorado had refined her high-altitude operational skills, while advanced diving certification in California had prepared her for the underwater components of SEAL training. Most significantly, she'd completed a civilian course in advanced tactical medicine that taught techniques used by special operations medics, knowledge that would prove crucial during her later SEAL career. The formal application process for SEAL training had required Maya to overcome institutional skepticism about female candidates while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded standard requirements. Her physical fitness scores had been exceptional, but more importantly, her psychological evaluations had identified the kind of mental resilience that SEAL instructors considered essential for successful completion of the pipeline. The combination of combat experience, medical expertise, and demonstrated stress tolerance had made her application impossible to dismiss on technical grounds. Maya's acceptance into SEAL training had come with unofficial warnings from several instructors who'd made clear their skepticism about women in special operations roles. The political pressure to integrate female candidates had created an environment where failure would be heavily scrutinized, while success would be attributed to lowered standards rather than individual capability. Maya had understood that her performance would be evaluated not just against her immediate peers, but against decades of institutional assumptions about what women could accomplish in combat. Rolls out the 26 weeks of basic underwater demolition SEAL training had tested every aspect of the preparation that Storm, Wolf, and her deployment experiences had provided. Hell Week alone had eliminated 60% of her class, including several male candidates whose physical capabilities had appeared superior to Maya's during initial assessments. Her success had depended less on raw strength than on the psychological conditioning that allowed her to continue functioning when exhaustion and pain convinced other candidates to quit. Maya's graduation from SEAL training had been a carefully managed public relations event, with media coverage that focused more on the historic nature of her achievement than on the tactical capabilities she demonstrated. But within the special operations community, her performance had earned grudging respect from instructors who'd expected her to fail and quiet admiration from teammates who'd observed her capabilities firsthand. As the Suburban continued its journey through the Nevada desert, Maya reflected on the irony of her current situation. All the training, deployments, and preparation that had brought her to this moment had been designed to prepare her for combat against foreign enemies. Instead, she was about to apply those skills against American criminals who'd made the fundamental error of believing that kidnapping a woman automatically meant capturing a victim. The criminal enterprise that had targeted Maya operated with the kind of systematic precision that came from years of successful operations and zero meaningful law enforcement interference. Vincent "Tank" Morrison wasn't just another street criminal looking for quick money. He was the operational leader of a sophisticated kidnapping ring that had generated over $12 million in ransom payments during the past 3 years without losing a single member to arrest or prosecution. Tank's organization specialized in what the FBI classified as express kidnapping, rapid abductions of high-value targets followed by immediate transportation to secure facilities where victims could be held safely while ransom negotiations proceeded through encrypted communication channels. Their success rate was exceptional because they'd solved the two primary challenges that destroyed most kidnapping operations: victim selection and location security. Tank's crew never grabbed targets randomly, and they never held victims in locations that could be traced back to their personal lives. The selection process that had identified Maya as a target reflected months of surveillance and research conducted by Tank's intelligence specialist, a former private investigator named Rebecca Recon Santos, who'd been dishonorably discharged from the Army after selling classified information to defense contractors. Santos had developed profiles on over 200 potential targets in the Las Vegas metropolitan area, ranking them according to family wealth, security awareness, and likelihood of compliance during ransom negotiations. Maya's profile had been built through social media analysis, financial record examination, and physical surveillance that had tracked her movements during the 3 days she'd spent in Las Vegas for her sister's engagement celebration. Santos had identified her as Sarah Blackwater's daughter, noting her father's military background and assuming that family discipline would translate into substantial financial resources. The assessment had concluded that Maya represented an ideal target: wealthy family background, limited personal security, and emotional value that would motivate rapid ransom payment. What Santos had missed during her investigation was any indication of Maya's military service or special operations background. Maya's social media presence had been carefully curated to present a civilian image, with photos focusing on family gatherings, outdoor recreation, and travel experiences that suggested affluent lifestyle without revealing professional details. Her Navy service had been deliberately omitted from public profiles, a standard operational security practice for SEAL personnel, whose exposure could compromise ongoing missions or create security vulnerabilities. Tank's second-in-command, Antonio Wires Castellanos, served as the organization's technical specialist, responsible for communication security, electronic surveillance, and facility management. Wires had spent 8 years working as a telecommunications engineer before discovering that his skills commanded higher prices in criminal markets than legitimate employment. His expertise had been essential in developing the secure communication protocols that allowed Tank's organization to conduct ransom negotiations without law enforcement interference. The Nevada facility where they intended to hold Maya represented the culmination of Wire's security planning and Tank's operational experience. Located in an abandoned mining complex 47 miles southeast of Las Vegas, the facility provided complete isolation while maintaining the infrastructure necessary for extended operations. Solar panels provided independent power generation. Satellite internet enabled secure communications, and underground storage areas offered multiple containment options for different categories of victims. Wires had modified the facility's security systems using commercial-grade equipment purchased through legitimate channels, creating a surveillance network that could monitor approach routes for miles in every direction. Motion sensors, thermal cameras, and acoustic detection systems provided early warning of any law enforcement or rescue attempts, while hardened communication systems allowed the organization to coordinate with external partners without interception risk. Tank's third crew member, David Flex Rodriguez, handled the physical security aspects of their operations, including victim restraint, facility protection, and tactical response if law enforcement intervention occurred. Flex had served 6 years in the Marine Corps before receiving a bad conduct discharge for assault charges, and his military experience had provided the tactical foundation for the organization's security protocols. The criminal methodology that had made Tank's organization successful relied on psychological manipulation as much as physical containment. Their victims were typically held in underground chambers designed to create sensory deprivation and psychological disorientation, conditions that reduced resistance while maintaining the stress levels necessary to motivate family cooperation during ransom negotiations. The facility's isolation meant that victims could scream for help without any possibility of being heard, a psychological factor that accelerated the acceptance of their situation. Tank's personal motivation for targeting women specifically stemmed from his assessment that female victims generated more emotional urgency during ransom negotiations, while presenting fewer security risks during transport and containment. His operational experience had taught him that families paid faster and asked fewer questions when daughters were threatened, and that women were less likely to attempt violent resistance during the critical early phases of captivity. The ransom demands that Tank's organization typically made reflected careful analysis of target, family finances, and psychological pressure points. Rather than demanding enormous sums that might trigger law enforcement involvement, they requested amounts that families could access quickly through liquidating investments or obtaining short-term loans. The typical ransom fell between $500,000 and $2 million, amounts that were significant enough to be profitable while remaining within the range that wealthy families could pay without involving banks or government agencies. Tank's organization had developed contingency plans for various law enforcement response scenarios, including protocols for victim disposal if rescue attempts appeared imminent. These plans reflected Tank's understanding that kidnapping charges could result in life sentences, making the elimination of witnesses a tactical necessity if operational security was compromised. The organization's success had created overconfidence in their security measures and tactical capabilities, leading them to believe that they could handle any threat that conventional law enforcement might present. The criminal intelligence that Santos had gathered about Maya's family had focused heavily on ransom payment capabilities while completely missing the tactical threat that Maya herself represented. The assessment had identified Storm Blackwater as a potential complication due to his military background, but had concluded that his age and civilian status made him unlikely to attempt rescue operations. The analysis had failed to consider that Storm's training might have been passed on to his daughter, or that Maya herself might possess capabilities that exceeded normal civilian limitations. As the Suburban approached the facility that Tank's organization considered impregnable, the criminals remained focused on the financial opportunity that Maya's kidnapping represented. Tank was already calculating profit margins and timeline logistics, while Wires reviewed communication protocols for initiating ransom negotiations, and Flex prepared containment procedures for processing their new victim. None of them had considered the possibility that they just transported a predator into their secure facility, or that their perfect crime was about to become their worst nightmare. The education and tactical superiority that Maya was preparing to provide would be comprehensive, permanent, and utterly devastating to their assumptions about power and control. The psychological breaking point that transformed Maya from victim to predator occurred at exactly 2,347 hours, when Tank's overconfidence finally crossed the line from criminal arrogance into personal violation. The Suburban had been parked outside the mining facility for 17 minutes while the crew conducted their standard security sweep, and Maya had used that time to complete her escape preparations. Her restraints were already compromised, her makeshift weapons were positioned for immediate use, and her tactical assessment of the facility's vulnerabilities was complete when Tank opened the trunk to gloat over his prize. "Welcome to your new home, Princess," Tank sneered as he leaned over the trunk opening, his bulk blocking most of the moonlight while his associates flanked him on either side. The tactical flashlight in his hand was positioned to blind Maya rather than illuminate her condition, a psychological intimidation technique that had proven effective with previous victims. Hope you're comfortable, because you're gonna be our guest until Daddy opens his wallet real wide." Maya remained motionless, projecting the defeated submission that Tank expected to see, while her enhanced night vision cataloged every detail of her captor's positioning and equipment. Tank carried a Glock 19 in a shoulder holster, positioned for a right-handed draw but secured with a thumb brake retention system that would slow his access time. Wires held a cattle prod in his left hand while keeping his right hand near a taser on his belt, indicating his preference for non-lethal crowd control over firearms. Flex positioned himself at Tank's left shoulder, carrying a collapsible baton and what appeared to be additional zip tie restraints. The facility itself met Maya's expectations based on the terrain analysis she'd conducted during the drive. The abandoned mining complex provided excellent concealment and isolation, but its age meant that security improvements were retrofitted rather than integrated, creating vulnerabilities that modern facilities would have eliminated through better design. Solar panel installations were visible on several buildings, indicating independent power generation that would be vulnerable to targeted disruption. Most importantly, the facility's remote location meant that any sounds of conflict would not attract outside attention. Tank's mistake came when he decided to demonstrate his dominance through physical intimidation, reaching into the trunk to grab Maya's ankle while delivering his prepared speech about cooperation and consequences. "Now we're gonna move you to more comfortable accommodations," he announced while his grip tightened enough to leave bruises. "But first, we need to establish some ground rules about how guests behave in my house." The violation of her personal space triggered the transformation that Maya's training had conditioned into her nervous system. Tank's hand on her ankle represented the tactical opening she'd been waiting for, the moment when her captor's overconfidence made them vulnerable to the kind of precise violence that Wolf had taught her to deliver without hesitation. Maya's response was immediate, devastating, and executed with the cold efficiency that had made her legendary among her SEAL teammates. Her right leg snapped upward in a movement that Tank's peripheral vision registered too late to avoid her boot heel connecting with his larynx with precisely the force necessary to crush his windpipe without killing him immediately. The strike had been calculated to disable his ability to shout warnings while maintaining his consciousness long enough to experience what happened next. Tank staggered backward, both hands clutching his throat while making the gurgling sounds that indicated successful tracheal damage. Maya's emergence from the trunk resembled a predator uncoiling from concealment, her movements fluid and controlled despite the confined space she'd occupied for nearly an hour. The makeshift weapons she'd prepared during the drive were all ready. In her hands, her titanium ring positioned for maximum cutting efficiency, and her ankle bracelet's steel cable formed into a flexible garrote that could serve multiple tactical functions. Wire's reaction time proved adequate for civilian confrontations, but hopelessly inadequate against someone with Maya's training and motivation. His attempt to deploy the cattle prod was interrupted when Maya's cable garrote wrapped around his wrist, the aircraft-grade steel cutting through his jacket and into his flesh, while she used his own forward momentum to pull him off balance. The cattle prod discharged harmlessly into the ground as Wires crashed first into the Suburban's rear bumper, his broken nose fountaining blood across the vehicle's surface. Flex demonstrated better tactical awareness than his partners, immediately recognizing that their situation had transformed from victim management into combat survival. His attempt to create distance while drawing his baton showed military training, but his movements telegraphed his intentions clearly enough for Maya to anticipate and counter his response. She closed the distance between them using a technique that Wolf had called predatory advance, movement that appeared defensive while positioning her for maximum offensive advantage. The psychological impact of watching their leader disabled and their technical specialist incapacitated created exactly the kind of hesitation that Maya had been trained to exploit. Flex's baton swing was powerful but poorly targeted, aimed at Maya's sent her mass rather than the specific targets that might have neutralized her offensive capabilities. Maya's counterattack demonstrated the difference between strength and precision. Her titanium ring opening a 4-inch gash across Flex's forearm while her opposite hand delivered a liver shot that dropped him to his knees. Tank's attempt to draw his weapon while struggling to breathe represented the kind of desperation that Maya had observed in multiple combat situations. His damaged larynx prevented him from coordinating with his remaining partners, while the pain and oxygen deprivation were rapidly degrading his fine motor control. Maya allowed him to clear his holster before demonstrating why disarming techniques were a fundamental component of SEAL close-quarters combat training. The Glock clattered across the rocky ground as Tank's dislocated wrist made weapon retention impossible, his weapon hand now hanging at an unnatural angle while he continued struggling for breath. Maya's systematic destruction of his defensive capabilities reflected the methodical approach that Wolf had taught her for dealing with multiple opponents. Disable the primary threat's ability to coordinate, neutralize secondary threats before they could adapt, then finish the primary threat when escape routes were secured. Wire's second attempt to engage Maya demonstrated the kind of poor tactical decision-making that occurred when criminals encountered resistance they hadn't prepared for. His deployment of the taser might have been effective against a civilian victim, but Maya's training had included extensive exposure to electrical weapons and the physiological responses they produced. She absorbed the electrical discharge while maintaining her offensive capabilities, a demonstration of conditioning that horrified her captors while confirming their worst fears about what they'd actually captured. The entire engagement from trunk opening to complete tactical control had lasted 37 seconds, during which Maya had transformed from apparent victim into dominant predator while her captors discovered the difference between intimidating helpless victims and confronting trained killers. As she stood over their disabled forms in the Nevada moonlight, zip-tying them with their own restraints, Maya felt the familiar calm that followed. Successful mission completion. Tank and his partners had wanted to educate her about powerlessness and submission. Instead, they were about to receive a comprehensive lesson in what happened when predators pretended to be prey. With Tank and his crew neutralized and secured, Maya found herself in possession of both tactical advantage and strategic options that required careful consideration. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but her situation remained complex. She was alone in the Nevada desert with 3 criminals who possessed detailed knowledge of a larger organization, an isolated facility that might contain evidence of previous crimes, and communication equipment that could be used to contact law enforcement or coordinate her own extraction. Maya's tactical assessment of her new circumstances began with a systematic evaluation of the resources now available to her. Tank's organization had inadvertently provided her with weapons, communication equipment, transportation, and a secure facility that could serve as an interrogation site if she chose to gather intelligence about their broader criminal activities. The irony wasn't lost on her that the criminals' own preparations for victim containment had created perfect conditions for reversing their roles. The facility's isolation, which Tank had considered an advantage for avoiding law enforcement detection, now worked in Maya's favor by providing the privacy necessary for conducting enhanced interrogation without outside interference. The underground chambers that had been designed to break victims' psychological resistance could serve equally well for extracting information from uncooperative prisoners. The communication equipment that Wires had installed for ransom negotiations could be used to contact federal authorities while maintaining operational security. Maya's decision-making process reflected the strategic thinking that had made her valuable to SEAL Team 7 during complex missions where multiple objectives competed for priority. She could simply contact local law enforcement and wait for rescue, but that approach would likely result in Tank's organization receiving relatively light sentences while their broader criminal network remained operational. Alternatively, she could use her temporary advantage to gather intelligence that might save future victims and dismantle the entire kidnapping operation. The professional approach that Maya chose reflected both her military training and her personal commitment to preventing other families from experiencing the trauma that Tank's organization inflicted on its victims. Rather than seeking immediate escape, she decided to conduct what special operations personnel called exploitation of opportunity, using unexpected tactical advantages to achieve objectives that exceeded the original mission parameters. Maya's first priority involved securing her prisoners and establishing communications with appropriate authorities while maintaining operational control over the situation. She used Tank's own zip tie restraints to secure each criminal in positions that prevented mutual assistance while ensuring their continued consciousness for interrogation purposes. Tank's crushed larynx required medical attention that Maya could provide using her corpsman training, but she chose to stabilize his condition rather than fully treat his injuries, keeping him functional but dependent on her continued care. The facility's communication center provided Maya with access to encrypted satellite internet, multiple cellular networks, and shortwave radio equipment that Wires had installed for maintaining contact with criminal associates across the western United States. Maya's technical training allowed her to analyze the communication logs and identify patterns that revealed the scope of Tank's organization and their relationships with other criminal enterprises. The intelligence value of this information was enormous, representing years of law enforcement investigation compressed into accessible digital records. Maya's interrogation of Wires began with techniques that Wolf had taught her for extracting information without leaving physical evidence of coercion. Psychological pressure combined with medical knowledge allowed her to create stress responses that made resistance increasingly difficult while maintaining plausible deniability about her methods. Wires' technical background made him particularly vulnerable to approaches that exploited his analytical personality and need to demonstrate intellectual superiority. The information that Maya extracted from Wires during the first hour of interrogation revealed a criminal network that extended far beyond simple kidnapping operations. Tank's organization served as a specialized contractor for various criminal enterprises, providing victim acquisition and containment services for human trafficking operations, corporate espionage schemes, and political intimidation campaigns. The facility in Nevada was one of 7 similar installations across 4 states, each designed to hold specific categories of victims for different operational purposes. Wires' cooperation accelerated dramatically when Maya demonstrated her familiarity with the kind of enhanced interrogation techniques that left no visible marks while producing intense psychological discomfort. Her medical training allowed her to induce symptoms that simulated serious illness while remaining completely reversible, creating the impression that his condition would continue deteriorating until he provided the information she required. The technique was psychologically devastating because it exploited his awareness that she possessed the knowledge necessary to either save or kill him. The intelligence that emerged from Wires' cooperation included detailed financial records showing that Tank's organization had generated over $12 million during the past 3 years while maintaining operational expenses below $2 million. The profit margins were extraordinary because their victim selection process focused on families who would pay quickly rather than involve law enforcement, and their facilities eliminated the ongoing security costs that destroyed most kidnapping operations. Maya's interrogation of Flex revealed the operational security measures that had allowed Tank's organization to avoid law enforcement detection, despite conducting dozens of kidnapping operations across multiple jurisdictions. Their success depended on victim families who prioritized rapid resolution over criminal prosecution, communication protocols that prevented electronic surveillance, and facility locations that remained invisible to conventional investigation methods. The most disturbing information that Maya extracted concerned Tank's organization's disposal methods for victims whose families couldn't or wouldn't pay ransom demands. The remote Nevada facility contained evidence of at least 6 murders, with victims buried in abandoned mine shafts that would never be discovered through conventional search methods. The revelation transformed Maya's tactical situation from simple escape and rescue into a federal investigation that could save lives and deliver justice for previous victims. Maya's strategic planning for the next phase of her operation required balancing multiple competing objectives while maintaining her tactical advantages. She needed to preserve the intelligence she'd gathered while ensuring that Tank's organization couldn't destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses before federal authorities could take control of the situation. The facility's isolation that had seemed like a disadvantage now provided the security necessary for conducting a thorough intelligence collection operation. The communication that Maya established with federal authorities used protocols that Wolf had taught her for contacting intelligence agencies during overseas operations. Rather than calling local law enforcement, she contacted the FBI's Violent Crimes Division using encrypted channels. That would preserve operational security while triggering the kind of federal response that Tank's organization couldn't influence through local corruption or political connections. As Maya prepared for the arrival of federal agents, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred since Tank first grabbed her ankle outside Rossetti's restaurant. What had begun as a simple kidnapping for ransom had evolved into a federal case that would dismantle a multi-state criminal organization while providing justice for victims whose families had never learned their fates. Tank's overconfidence had not only failed to break her spirit, it had provided her with the opportunity to demonstrate why Navy SEALs were trained to turn any situation into mission success. The tactical situation that Maya orchestrated during the next 6 hours transformed the abandoned mining facility into a carefully controlled crime scene that would provide federal investigators with unprecedented insight into one of the most successful kidnapping operations in American criminal history. Her systematic exploitation of the intelligence treasure trove that Tank's organization had unwittingly preserved demonstrated why SEAL training emphasized turning unexpected opportunities into mission-critical advantages. Maya's methodical documentation of the facility began with photographing evidence using Tank's own equipment, creating a comprehensive visual record that would withstand legal scrutiny while preserving details that might be overlooked during conventional investigation. The underground chambers that had been designed for victim containment contained physical evidence of psychological torture techniques, including sensory deprivation equipment, stress positioning apparatus, and recording devices used to capture victim statements for ransom negotiations. The most damning evidence that Maya discovered was hidden in Wire's encrypted computer systems, which contained detailed records of every kidnapping operation the organization had conducted during the past 4 years. The files included victim photographs, family financial assessments, ransom negotiation transcripts, and disturbingly, video recordings of victim conditioning sessions designed to break psychological resistance. Maya's technical training allowed her to bypass Wire's security protocols and copy the entire database onto portable storage devices before federal agents arrived. Tank's gradual recovery from his laryngeal trauma provided Maya with the opportunity to conduct strategic interrogation that revealed information beyond what Wires and Flex had been able to provide. As the organization's leader, Tank possessed knowledge of financial networks, political connections, and law enforcement contacts that had protected their operations from investigation. His cooperation was motivated by Maya's medical treatment, which she provided just enough to keep him functional while making clear that his Continued survival depended on her goodwill. The intelligence that Tank provided under duress revealed corruption networks that extended into multiple law enforcement agencies across Nevada, Arizona, and California. Sheriff's deputies, state police investigators, and even federal agents had received payments for providing advance warning of investigation activities or deliberately misdirecting searches away from areas where Tank's organization operated. The scope of official corruption explained how such a visible criminal enterprise had avoided detection despite conducting operations that should have triggered immediate federal attention. Maya's interrogation techniques reflected the psychological operations training that had made her valuable during overseas missions where intelligence gathering was often more important than direct action. She understood that effective interrogation required understanding each subject's personality and motivations, then applying pressure to psychological vulnerabilities rather than relying purely on physical coercion. Tank's ego and need to be perceived as intelligent made him particularly susceptible to approaches that allowed him to demonstrate his operational knowledge while providing the information Maya required. The arrival of FBI Special Agent Sarah Chun and her tactical team at 0634 hours marked the beginning of what would become one of the largest federal racketeering investigations in recent history. Agent Chun's initial assessment of the scene reflected years of experience with kidnapping cases, but even her extensive background hadn't prepared her for the level of intelligence preservation and criminal control that Maya had achieved during her solo operation. Maya's briefing for the federal team demonstrated the kind of tactical precision that impressed even experienced investigators. She had organized the evidence according to federal prosecution requirements, separated intelligence by source reliability, and prepared detailed written reports that would satisfy evidentiary standards for multiple felony charges. Her systematic approach to crime scene preservation had protected evidence that criminal organizations typically destroyed immediately after operations. Concluded. The tactical debriefing that Agent Chun conducted with Maya revealed capabilities that exceeded normal civilian training while remaining consistent with advanced military instruction. Maya's explanation of her escape techniques, facility assessment, and prisoner control methods reflected professional-level expertise that immediately raised questions about her background and training sources. Agent Chun's security clearance allowed her to access classified databases that confirmed Maya's SEAL credentials while explaining capabilities that would otherwise seem impossible for a civilian kidnapping victim. Tank's organization had prepared contingency plans for law enforcement intervention, but those plans had assumed conventional investigation methods rather than the kind of comprehensive intelligence exploitation that Maya had conducted. Their communication protocols, facility security, and evidence destruction procedures were designed to counter traditional federal investigation techniques, leaving them completely vulnerable to the unconventional approach that Maya's training had enabled. The federal investigation that emerged from Maya's intelligence gathering ultimately identified 47 victims across a 4-year period, including 6 murder victims whose remains were recovered from mine shafts throughout the Nevada facility. The financial investigation revealed money laundering operations that had processed over $15 million through legitimate businesses, creating a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple kidnapping into organized crime activities that threatened public safety across multiple states. Wire's cooperation with federal investigators, motivated by Maya's psychological conditioning and the overwhelming evidence she had preserved, provided prosecutors with detailed testimony about operational methods, victim selection criteria, and the technical infrastructure that had made Tank's organization successful. His technical expertise made him particularly valuable for understanding the communication networks and financial systems that other criminal organizations used for similar operations. Flex's military background had made him confident in his ability to resist interrogation, but Maya's superior training and access to his medical records allowed her to exploit psychological vulnerabilities that conventional interrogation would never have identified. His eventual cooperation provided tactical intelligence about facility security, prisoner transport methods, and the weapons caches that Tank's organization maintained at different locations throughout the western United States. The charges that federal prosecutors ultimately filed against Tank's organization included multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering under federal statutes that carried potential death sentences for the most serious offenses. The evidence that Maya had preserved was so comprehensive that plea negotiations became impossible, forcing all defendants to face trial with virtually no hope of acquittal. Maya's transformation from victim to federal asset had taken less than 12 hours, but the intelligence she provided would support prosecutions and investigations for years to come. Her systematic dismantling of Tank's organization demonstrated why special operations training emphasized adaptability and mission focus over conventional responses to unexpected situations. As federal agents continued processing the crime scene that Maya had secured and documented, Agent Chun reflected on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed. Tank's perfect kidnapping had not only failed catastrophically, it had resulted in the complete destruction of a criminal organization that had considered itself untouchable. The federal prosecution that emerged from Maya's intelligence gathering became a landmark case that fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approached organized kidnapping investigations. Within 72 hours of the facility raid, FBI Director Harrison Martinez had authorized the creation of a joint task force comprising agents from the Bureau's Violent Crimes Division, the DEA's Financial Crimes Unit, and specialized prosecutors from the Justice Department's Organized Crime Section. The scope of Tank's criminal network had exceeded even experienced investigators' expectations, requiring resources typically reserved for international terrorism cases. Tank himself faced a superseding federal indictment that included 17 counts of kidnapping, 6 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit racketeering, money laundering through criminal enterprise, and the use of interstate commerce facilities to conduct illegal activities. The evidence that Maya had preserved was so comprehensive that Tank's defense attorneys immediately began exploring plea negotiations, recognizing that their client faced multiple potential death sentences if the case proceeded to trial. The murder charges represented the most serious aspects of the prosecution, stemming from Maya's discovery of victim remains in the facility's abandoned mine shafts. Forensic analysis confirmed that Tank's organization had systematically executed victims whose families either couldn't pay ransom demands or had contacted law enforcement despite explicit warnings. The methodical nature of these killings demonstrated the kind of calculated violence that federal prosecutors used to justify capital punishment requests. Wires received a federal indictment that reflected his central role in maintaining the technical infrastructure that made Tank's organization possible. His charges included conspiracy to commit kidnapping, accessory to murder charges for victims whose deaths he had facilitated through communication intercepts, and violations of federal computer crime statutes for his role in electronic surveillance of victim families. The evidence of his technical sophistication made him particularly valuable as a cooperating witness, leading to a plea agreement that reduced his potential sentences in exchange for testimony against other criminal organizations. Flex's military background had initially suggested that he might resist cooperation with federal investigators. But the overwhelming evidence that Maya had gathered eliminated any realistic hope of acquittal. His charges included kidnapping, accessory to murder, conspiracy, and federal weapons violations for the arsenal that investigators discovered at the Nevada facility. His eventual cooperation provided tactical intelligence about prisoner transport methods and security protocols that helped investigators understand how similar criminal organizations operated across multiple jurisdictions. Broader investigation that grew from Maya's intelligence gathering ultimately identified connections between Tank's organization and criminal enterprises operating throughout the western United States. Financial records revealed that Tank's kidnapping operation had served as a specialized contractor for human trafficking networks, corporate espionage schemes, and political intimidation campaigns that reached into state and federal government agencies. The corruption investigation that emerged from Tank's revelations resulted in criminal charges against law enforcement personnel in Nevada, Arizona, and California who had provided protection for criminal activities in exchange for regular payments. Sheriff's deputies who had misdirected searches, state police investigators who had delayed federal notifications, and federal agents who had compromised ongoing investigations all faced charges that would end their careers and result in substantial prison sentences. Maya's role in the federal prosecution required careful management to protect her identity while preserving the intelligence value of her testimony. Federal prosecutors worked with Navy Special Warfare Command to develop cover stories that would allow Maya to testify about her experiences without revealing operational details that might compromise ongoing SEAL missions or endanger other special operations personnel. Her testimony was scheduled for closed sessions that would protect classified information while providing juries with sufficient detail to understand the scope of Tank's criminal activities. Financial investigation that federal agents conducted using Maya's intelligence revealed money laundering operations that had processed over $28 million through legitimate businesses across multiple states. Tank's organization had used car dealerships, construction companies, and real estate investment firms to convert ransom payments into legitimate income, while avoiding detection by financial crimes investigators. The complexity of these operations required specialized forensic accounting that revealed criminal sophistication far beyond what typical kidnapping organizations achieved. The victim identification process that emerged from the facility investigation ultimately confirmed 49 kidnapping victims across a 5-year period, including the 6 murder victims whose remains Maya had helped locate. Family notifications for these cases required sensitive coordination between federal agents and local law enforcement agencies, many of which had conducted unsuccessful missing person investigations without realizing that their cases were connected to an organized criminal enterprise. The trial preparation process revealed that Tank's organization had maintained detailed psychological profiles on hundreds of potential victims, including surveillance photographs, financial assessments, and tactical evaluations of family security measures. This intelligence demonstrated the kind of systematic preparation that explained how Tank's crew had achieved such a high success rate while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that were theoretically monitoring for exactly these types of criminal activities. Maya's impact on federal kidnapping investigation protocols extended beyond the specific prosecutions that emerged from her case. FBI training academies began incorporating lessons learned from her tactical response into curricula for agents who might encounter similar situations during their careers. Her systematic approach to evidence preservation and Intelligence gathering became a model for how kidnapping victims could contribute to their own rescue while gathering information that would prevent future crimes. The sentencing phase that concluded Tank's prosecution reflected the unprecedented nature of the evidence that Maya had provided. Tank received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, effectively ensuring that he would never again threaten innocent civilians. Wires received 47 years in federal prison despite his cooperation with investigators, while Flex's sentence of 32 years reflected both his military background and his eventual assistance with the broader investigation. The facility that had been designed to break victims' spirits became the foundation for one of the most successful federal prosecutions in recent history. Maya's refusal to accept the role of helpless victim had not only saved her own life, it had delivered justice for dozens of previous victims while dismantling a criminal organization that had considered itself beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Transformation from victim to federal asset that Maya had achieved in less than 24 hours demonstrated why special operations training emphasized turning unexpected situations into tactical advantages. Tank's organization had believed they were capturing prey, but they had actually provided a predator with exactly the opportunity she needed to demonstrate the difference between criminal confidence and professional competence. 3 years after the Nevada facility had been transformed from a criminal enterprise into a federal crime scene, Maya stood in the briefing room at SEAL Team 7 headquarters, addressing a joint training session for special operations personnel and FBI hostage rescue specialists. The case study that emerged from her kidnapping experience had become required reading at military academies, law enforcement training facilities, and intelligence agencies worldwide, demonstrating how individual preparation and tactical thinking could transform apparent defeat into strategic victory. The Bronze Star that Maya had earned for her actions during the kidnapping incident occupied a place of honor in her personal quarters, but the medal itself represented only a fraction of the lasting impact that her tactical response had generated. The intelligence she had gathered during those critical hours in the Nevada desert had prevented an estimated 37 additional kidnappings, saved the lives of potential murder victims, and dismantled criminal networks across 4 states that had operated with impunity for years. Maya's military career had continued to flourish following her return to active duty, with assignment to increasingly sensitive missions that reflected the confidence her superiors placed in her judgment and capabilities. Her promotion to Senior Chief Petty Officer had come ahead of the normal timeline, recognition of leadership abilities that had been forged through experiences that few military personnel ever encountered. The kidnapping incident had become a defining moment that proved her readiness for the kind of complex operations that required both tactical excellence and strategic thinking. The speaking engagements that Maya conducted at military installations and law enforcement academies provided her with opportunities to share lessons that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of her own experience. Her presentations focused on the psychological preparation necessary for transforming victimization into tactical advantage, emphasizing that survival often depended more on mental conditioning than physical capabilities. The techniques that Wolf had taught her in that Montana cabin had proven their value under conditions that even her grandfather couldn't have anticipated. The family legacy that had shaped Maya's character reached its culmination during a ceremony at the Montana ranch where Storm and Sarah Blackwater welcomed federal agents, military commanders, and law enforcement officials who had gathered to honor their daughter's achievements. Storm's pride was evident as he listened to testimonials from investigators whose careers had been advanced by the intelligence Maya had provided, while Sarah's medical perspective allowed her to appreciate the clinical precision with which her daughter had managed a life-threatening situation. The memorial service for the 6 murder victims whose remains had been recovered from the Nevada facility provided Maya with an opportunity to meet family members whose loved ones had finally received justice after years of uncertainty. The gratitude expressed by these families reminded her that the tactical decisions she had made during those critical hours had delivered more than personal survival. They had provided closure for people whose lives had been shattered by Tank's criminal organization. Maya's influence on federal kidnapping investigation protocols had resulted in fundamental changes to how law enforcement agencies approached missing person cases involving potential organized crime. Training programs now emphasize the intelligence value that prepared victims could provide, while investigation procedures incorporated lessons learned from Maya's systematic evidence preservation and prisoner interrogation techniques. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had incorporated her case study into profiles used for understanding how criminal organizations selected and processed victims. The international recognition that Maya's case had generated included invitations to address law enforcement conferences in countries where kidnapping represented a significant public safety threat. Her presentations in Mexico, Colombia, and the Philippines had provided tactical insights that helped local authorities develop countermeasures against criminal organizations that had previously operated with minimal government interference. The techniques she had developed for evidence preservation and intelligence gathering had proven applicable across cultural and legal boundaries. The ongoing investigation that had grown from Maya's initial intelligence gathering continued to generate prosecutions. 3 years after Tank's conviction, federal prosecutors had used the financial network she had exposed to track criminal proceeds through multiple countries, resulting in asset forfeiture actions that had recovered over $43 million in criminal proceeds. The money had been used to compensate victim families while funding expanded law enforcement programs designed to prevent similar criminal enterprises. Maya's personal reflection on the transformation she had experienced during those critical hours revealed insights that extended beyond tactical or professional considerations. The kidnapping had tested every aspect of the preparation that Storm Wolf and her military training had provided, but it had also demonstrated the psychological strength that came from refusing to accept powerlessness as an inevitable condition. The choice to fight rather than submit had defined not only her survival, but her character. The mentorship role that Maya had accepted with younger SEAL candidates reflected her commitment to passing on lessons that couldn't be learned from manuals or classroom instruction. Her training sessions emphasized the importance of psychological preparation for situations where conventional tactics might prove inadequate, teaching students to view obstacles as opportunities for demonstrating capabilities that opponents couldn't anticipate. The foundation that Wolf had built in that Montana cabin continued to influence new generations of warriors. Through Maya's instruction, the civilian recognition that Maya had received included honorary degrees from universities whose criminal justice programs had incorporated her case study into curricula designed to train the next generation of law enforcement professionals. Speaking engagements at these institutions provided her with opportunities to influence academic perspectives on victim psychology and criminal behavior, contributing to research that would shape policy decisions for decades to come. As Maya concluded her presentation to the joint training session, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from that trunk in the Nevada desert to this moment of professional recognition and personal fulfillment. Tank's organization had intended to break her spirit and profit from her family's desperation, but their fundamental misunderstanding of what they had captured had transformed their criminal enterprise into their own destruction. The legacy that Maya carried forward honored not only her own survival and tactical success, but the memory of victims who hadn't possessed her training or opportunities for resistance. Her refusal to accept the role of helpless victim had proven that preparation, determination, and tactical thinking could overcome even the most carefully planned criminal operations. The predator that Tank had accidentally kidnapped had not only escaped, she had systematically destroyed everything he had built while ensuring that his victims received justice. In the end, Tank's crew had indeed learned what happens when you lock a Navy SEAL in a trunk. The education they received had been comprehensive, permanent, and delivered with exactly the kind of precision that they should have expected from someone trained to turn any situation into mission success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.